Welcome to this program all about return on investment in soft skills training. Be still my beating heart. It sounds amazing, doesn't it? What a program to get into. My name's Graham David and I work with Blue Beetle People Solutions, and over the last 3 decades I've been involved in training programs, conferences and events in a number of different countries, working for all sorts of different sized clients in all sorts of sectors. And one of the things that I've noticed consistently is that people don't like trying to figure out what value or otherwise they've got from their soft skills training. In fact, if I think back to the late 90s, early 2000s, one of the articles of faith that was often put about was that you can't measure the value of soft skills training. You can't put a numerical figure to it, which is an interesting concept, isn't it? Because what we're saying, if we believe that, is that we spend our corporate money on stuff and we don't really know why we're doing it. Now, let's be honest, there is a degree in any training program or any event or any conference where actually we're saying, well, it's the greater good, it's bringing people together, it's something that's intangible. And all of that makes sense. I get it completely. But it doesn't cut a lot of weight when it comes to dealing with our SLT or our board, does it? When it comes to dealing with whoever's in charge of the budget or signing off your budget. And whether that's an internal part of the business or whether it's external suppliers that you're bringing in, the cold, hard reality is that cold, hard cash is going to beat the argument every time. So what we ought to be doing is understanding exactly why within learning and development, within the training function, whether we are buying in expertise or whether we are delivering this ourselves, we really ought to know why we're doing that. What is it that we're spending our budget on? What is the tangible measure that we are seeing as a result? And I get it completely, because within L&D, within the HR functions, the kind of bits of the business that tend to be buying in learning developments or organising and developing and delivering learning developments, there's often quite a strong drive from a people perspective. And so often we find people who will be saying, well, you know, they all came out saying what a great session it was, and it was so positive, and everyone's talking about this topic now, and I think it's really moved the needle, and all of that feels like it makes sense. But let's get real for a moment. It probably doesn't cut the weight that we would like it to. It doesn't have the impact that we want it to. And ultimately, when it comes to difficult problems in the economy or worldwide issues or just issues that we're having within the business or the organisation, if there's somewhere we can cut money, we're going to be attracted to something that can't demonstrate its value. And so L&D is often seen as a cost centre. And I think we ought to be working towards making it a profit centre. We ought to be doing what we're doing and demonstrating that we can make or save money. We ought to be adding to the bottom line. Now, let me just recap slightly. If I go back to the early 2000s, we're talking 2000, 2001, my company at that point was three, four years old. I had a number of different ways that I was trying to make money. I guess this was a side hustle, we might call it today. So I had a number of different ventures I was doing, and the L&D bit was starting to pick up, and training companies were hiring us for what we did, and we went in and we made the session more engaging, and we got way better feedback than they were getting. And 2000, 2001, we started to pick up our own clients, and one particular client really ran with our offer. And within a short time, we were running up and down the country. We were staying in hotels and venues and going to these big meeting places. And our sessions were often 2 days. They were often off-site. So we'd do a Monday, Tuesday, and a Wednesday and Thursday cohort. Most weeks in a month, we had those. I had different teams of people going out, staying in hotels. And it was fantastic. I have to tell you, the results we were getting were off a scale. We were getting comments about, this is the most incredible training I've ever experienced. This is the best thing this company's ever done. We need to hire these people to do everything. Somebody had told me at some point that they'd collated all the percentages and all the scores from all their training providers, and we were 20% in front of the nearest competitor. And you can imagine, can't you? This was a new venture for me. It was an area that I was reasonably new to, and it really felt like, wow, this is fantastic. This is really going somewhere. And then one day, after another particularly successful day, I got a phone call, and the phone call was from Darren, who wanted to ask exactly what we are getting from your training. Now, I know that sounds slightly aggressive, but it wasn't. Actually, Darren asked a very, very reasonable question, and Darren himself, lovely chap. And in that space, in that moment, when all the feedback we were getting was, this is off the scale, it's the best thing ever, there was a degree of me, I think, that couldn't believe the question. What do you mean? What are you getting from the training? And I started saying, well, you know, this person said this and this person said that, and the people come into the session and they've heard how good things about us, and we're on session 3 now, or we're topic 3, and we've got all these different cohorts. He said, yeah, I know all that. He said, I don't have a moment's issue about any of that. But what I'm asking you is, what is the business benefiting as a result of the training programs that you're running? And I had that moment that you sometimes get as an adult where you think, I ought to know the answer to this, and I don't. I don't really know what I should be saying. And we spent about 3-4 months looking at the programs. We spent about 3-4 months figuring out what we were doing and what was working and what wasn't. And what we needed to do, of course, was to demonstrate a return on investment. We needed to be able to start to say, for the money that you spend on these programs, this is what you're getting back. And what you're getting back isn't going to be good enough for you in terms of they're having a great time. Everyone's buzzing about it. Everyone says it's the best program ever. Because what Darren explained to me was a really genius challenge to me, saying, well, they said it's the best program ever. And it was this. He said, I could take a cohort of people in your program and I could take them to the pub and I could buy them drinks all afternoon. And it would cost a fraction of what it costs to bring you in for a training program. And not only would it cost less, but the feedback would be better. That's quite a sobering thought, isn't it? And what had happened when I very first met this client, I spoke to my contact who wanted to bring us in, and I said, what would be a great measure for us to aspire to? What will tell me that we're doing this right? And she said, if you make me look good. And I went, assuming she was joking. She said, no. She said, think it through. If you make me look good, it means that the training's landing well. Everyone's talking about it. We're getting the results that we're wanting to get. And she said, and that will reflect on me as the person that brought you into the business. And she said, and that will reflect on my boss, because she has given me the leeway to decide how to do this. So she said, if I do that, that will make me look good. That will make her look good. And that in turn will make her look good to Darren. And Darren is the person who reports to the board. But this meant something more. This meant something a little bit deeper. This meant getting into what's the actual value of what we're doing. How do we measure that? And the problem, of course, is that when you start to think about return on investment for soft skills, that echo comes back. You can't measure soft skills. Well, it turns out you can, and it turns out it's quite easy. And one of the areas that we realised that we had got into, and I think many L&D people get into this, is that we try and design training that we think will be interesting and engaging and thought-provoking, which is good. Of course, and training has to be something that people want to do. They ought to be coming out, this is great. But we need to go beyond that. And so the 3 steps that we got into, my company started using this phrase, work hard, play harder, learn more. And the way we defined that was working hard was the session was going to be full of content and ideas and tools and tips and things that they were going to be doing. There was no sitting around looking at a PowerPoint screen. Play harder was they were going to feel like they were having a great time. And our choice was we use drama and drama facilities and engagement like that to make sessions feel more interesting and, dare I say, the F word, fun. So the content was going to be there. It was going to be absolutely practical. It was going to be engaging content and activities that people wanted to do. Work hard, play harder, learn more. We wanted to make everything that we delivered something you could take into the workplace and do something with immediately and start to see an improvement. And it took us 3 to 4 months. We had to rewrite the programs that we had with this client. But what it meant was that when we then relaunched, everything that we did, you could measure pretty much. And that particular business hired a full-time auditor in order to go around and catch up with managers and management trainees who've been on our program and say, right, what have you learned? What are you doing differently? And what's the benefits to the business? The cost of the business was well established. That was us. And the hotels and the bar bills. So that was the cost to the business. What now is the business starting to get back in return for that investment? Now, the return on investment model, of course, most people who have worked for any time in this space will have come across the Kirkpatrick-Phillips Model. But I want you to take a look at it again. If it's something that you've dabbled with over the years and fallen out of love with, I can tell you that's not a massive surprise, because most people, if you look at any statistics, look at any numbers, most people, if they do any of this at all, fizzle out by number 3. And actually, we ought to be pushing through to number 5, and there ought to be something we do beyond that as well, which I'll come to later on in this program. Number 1, the reaction. That's the most obvious basic stage. And I learned pretty early on that the feedback forms, the happy sheets as we called them, the official complaint forms you would call them if you were not having such a good session, are a basic first level stage about how did we do. And you ought to be doing something for this in this space, whether it is the bit of paper you hand out at the end of the session, whether it's the digital version you send afterwards. The digital version, by the way, will usually get less respondents than if you make them fill in on the day. But I will share this with you. If you are buying in your training provision, then most training providers are really good at getting excellent scores on the paperwork. There are a number of ruses people use so that people write really good stuff. But that aside, it's a slightly trite measure, but it's an important measure. We ought to know, what do our delegates think of the program? What did they learn? What do they feel they learned? What kind of comments are we reading there that give us some concerns? To what extent was the trainer operating at the right level? How good were the joining instructions? That might be some feedback for you. What was the venue like? Do we want to ask about cookies and catering? Well, we might do. It might be something that's important to us. The point being that we must get some sense of the reaction of our learners. And if we think of one cohort of 10 learners, let's just keep that as a number in mind, then we ought to get some sense of those 10 people. What was their experience joining and being on the program, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's digital? It's a key set of processes. If everybody comes back and says the platform we were using was diabolical, it was awful, it was clunky, please can we use Zoom? I don't have shares in Zoom. This is just an example. So if we hate the platform, it might be up until that point you've gone, well, that's just people moaning. But if you get that week in, week out, maybe it's time to take a look at that, because that is impacting your ability to deliver the training you want to deliver. So we must do the reaction. And that leads us into, quite nicely, the learning. So what did you get from this program that you didn't know before? Where do we get that from? Well, people will tell us. Tutor observation. We might have some assessments. We might have some tests. We might have a sit down with somebody a week or a little bit later on just to say, so, okay, just walk me through the kinds of things you did. We're going to do some role play. What do they write on their forms? What was the 3 biggest, most useful things that you got from today's session? What was the thing that you felt was least useful? So in all of those situations, what we're doing is we are creating, from one, what did you get on with, into learning, what were the bits you took from a session. Now, the other reason you ought to be doing that is that if you've got an external, you can say to them, look, everybody says that bit was the most useful. Do more of that bit. If you're running an internal session and everyone says, I really hated the venue because this problem with the parking. Well, it allows you to contact the venue and have a reasonable conversation. Why would you not do that? So tell me what you learned from the session. Number 2, what are you seeing? What transfer has happened? What can you see that has been an improvement? Which takes you into behavior. And this is where everybody fizzles out. The reason everybody fizzles out is, there's multiple reasons. So the first reason is that it's going to typically be 4 to 6 weeks later. Think about it. If you've gone on a program for coaching and you've learned how to do Tigro or the Clear model or whatever you've got into, and you're coming out bristling with excitement and you want to start coaching people, so you can talk in your feedback about your learning, you got a lot from it, everything was great. Well, you now need some time to actually do coaching, don't you? So we would typically suggest it's 4 to 6 weeks later. If it's less than that, there's a chance they've been on leave for a couple of weeks, they had to cover Bob who was sick, something went wrong with the server and it was all hands on. Right, you get the point. And so we need to give people a little bit of time, 4 to 6 weeks. If it's much longer than that, there's every chance that if you don't put a measure in, or you don't put some kind of test in or some kind of catch up, they'll just fall out of the habit of doing it. So what behaviors are we seeing? So one problem is that time gap between the reaction and the learning, which are pretty much on the day or immediately after, through to 4 to 6 weeks later. Another problem is just the numbers. So if we've got our one cohort of 10 people, well, if that's the entire learning population in your business, that's great. That's relatively easy to track, isn't it? But if I take you back to the example I gave you earlier on, we were doing 2 cohorts a week, 3 or 4 weeks in a month. And we were doing that month after month after month. So suddenly you get that thing 4 to 6 weeks later, and then another one, then another one, then another one. That's a lot to start to tabulate and track. And there's another problem as well, of course, because behaviours, whilst they might be observed by managers of the individual, they might also come from the individual. In both these cases, there's an inbuilt resistance to having to respond to you because it doesn't feel like day-to-day work. Day-to-day work, I've got to deal with the customers. I've got to deal with Bob, who's late again. I've got to deal with my laptop has exploded. That's the day-to-day pull on my time. If I then get an email from L&D or HR saying, so how did they do? And I'm thinking, I don't know, what was that, 4 weeks ago? Not too sure. So we need to start building this in so that it doesn't become a problem and a drain on people's time. Because otherwise you in L&D or HR are going to spend all your time trying to track people down. And most people in this space have done that. And they keep messaging out and they keep calling up 5 minutes. I want to catch up with you. How are they doing? And this is why at number 3, lots of organisations just don't bother. It becomes too onerous a task. So what we need to do is to start to create a way that the individuals themselves can track some of this change and information. What behaviours are they starting to note? And the way that we often do it, it comes back to that concept of every tool, tip and technique, every theory that we share. We're not sharing with you because it's interesting. We're sharing with you because you can use it. So when you are 4 to 6 weeks later on, what you ought to have been building up as an individual from the program over a bit of time, just jot it down in a notebook. It doesn't need a big, vast on-screen thing to fill in. But every time you've used a particular technique, just jot down what you've done. Just start to notice what you're noticing. And this takes an important change, or makes an important change to the concept of an L&D program, where you might go once a month, or you might go to a 2-day event, or a couple of hours here and there online. Those moments are important, but the real importance is the long-term return to what you learned and what you're doing with it. Because if we can keep doing that, then we start to see over a period of time a change in behaviour. Because once we track, either personally or as a manager who has agreed they'll do this for us, once we begin to track those changes in behaviour, then at number 4 we can start to see the impact. If on a coaching program I recognise the value of moving away from command and control management, in other words, where I just tell people what to do all day long and they have to ask me and I give them the answers, we might recognise that that means I become the bottleneck because every decision has to go through me. So it might be explained to me that coaching, whilst it's going to be a pain to start with. It's going to be awkward because there's going to be this 3-4 week window whilst people get used to the fact that this is the new way of doing things. If we can push through that, we ought to see people start to become more self-sufficient. And unless something's in place with me directly, if I'm the learner, or with my manager, if they're helping me with this, I'm going to go back to the normal world very quickly. You know what it's like when somebody comes out of a training program and they're all excited. You might have experienced this yourself. You're like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to put that in, I'm going to put the people on the psychometric, I'm going to organise everybody, I'm going to work out. It feels great. And then 1 week into it, everything goes wrong. Customer has a major issue. New member of staff doesn't show up one day. Somebody else has a meltdown. And you're back to where you used to be. And so the only way that I'm going to stick with that coaching argument is if I can see improvement. And the only way I'm going to see improvement is if I jot down every time at number 3, I do something different. And when I do that, I then jot down number 4. So what was that impact? And once that becomes a habit, whether it's me as a learner or me as a manager managing somebody else, we can start to generate real data that is showing these are changes that happened as a result of our program. Too many people think that because they've shown something, or been shown something, or they've learned something on a program, that's it, job done. But of course it's not. It's the long-term process of change that we need to begin to see. Now, if we've got our reaction and our learning, yes, I learned these things, and I've started to track my behaviour change over 4 to 6 weeks, and then I've tracked the impact of each of those behaviour changes, it's a stroll in the park to get to number 5, the return on investment. How much money am I now making or saving as a result of those changes? And this is the next stage. People get a little bit stuck because they tend to say, yeah, but it's not precise. How do I put a value on me coaching somebody rather than telling them? How do I put a value on me having a conversation with Bob, who was late 3 times this week? Well, I'm going to whisper the answer. You do need to make some assumptions. You do need to do some averages. You do need to work on the basis that probably that's going to be the result. And that makes some people a little bit nervous. But imagine, if you will, the idea of compounding improvement. If you've never mentioned or measured, I should say, return on investment on a training program previously, when you first start, it's likely you're making all sorts of wild assumptions and your data might not be very accurate. But there will be something there that you can use. And the more that you do it, the better your ability to track change will actually become. And when you can track change better, when it becomes easier for you, when it becomes more accurate, you'll then be able to start to track the impact and the return that that has. But you are going to need to make some assumptions. What you're going to have to start to do is to assign value to certain events. How do we do that? Well, number 5 is all about spending less money, or spending more efficiently, or making more money, which might mean more sales or greater value or add-on sales. It's about managing processes better, so managing, for example, requests for overtime more effectively. It's about doing a task that used to take you an hour, perhaps in 15 minutes, with no noticeable breakdown of quality. It's about having conversations that you don't want to have, but actually when you do, you manage to make a change in the dynamic and get the response that you wanted. And rather than it becoming a 1 hour standoff with your colleague, it's done in 5 minutes, everything's great, and you're back to full productivity. So often we're going to do things like assume a hourly cost. Now we can base that on salary, we can average that over the departments, we can do that all sorts of ways. And this is why those assumptions initially feel a bit uncomfortable. But the value of doing it is that then we quite quickly begin to work out far more of a sense of the value of anything. I will give you a couple of examples. Some years ago, I ran a management program which ran over 3 days, and what we had done was we had removed all of the nice to have content, all of the content that was interesting or thought-provoking, whatever. It was still, of course, as thought-provoking, as engaging, as interesting as it could be. But every tool, tip and technique that we shared was something that delegates could do. They could use it pretty much immediately. And when they used it, they would start to see some improvement. So what we did was we taught all of the delegates, when they were thinking about their behavior and their impact, to start to think, right, what tools are you going to take away from this program and that you're going to track? So one program for over 3 days. One tool of that one program was about delegation. And what we shared with the delegates was, here's a tool to allow you to more efficiently delegate than you are currently. Because at the time they were just doing it ad hoc and their overtime costs were getting quite substantial. So we figured out a way to share with them, here's a nice, easy way to delegate that will give you more control back. And we caught up with them 4 to 6 weeks later. Now, we talked about all sorts of models and techniques they'd used, but this was one model that many of them said, I want to use. Of those that said they used it, they had tracked between 1 and 8 hours saving per week. Now, let's say 10 delegates did that. So that's between 1 and 8 hours. Now, I'm going to round that down because I want these to be as bulletproof as possible. In other words, 10 delegates, 1 hour each, 10 hours per week. So over a 4-week period, that's 40 hours. 40 hours of management cost. Now I can work that out. I can take an average of the salaries and I can work that out to an hourly. Pretty simple to do, and say 40 hours in that first month. Now, once I start to do that, part of your brain is going, yeah, but it's not precise because that person earns more and that person earns less. And what if that person did 3 hours and that person did 90 minutes? And that's fine. What we're starting to do is just work with this as a concept. And what we start to see when you do this is that your data improves quite rapidly because you get into the idea of this is really good. We were able to go back to the client and show them in the first 4 to 6 weeks, the savings alone had completely dwarfed the cost of the 3-day program. So that was in the first 4 to 6 weeks. Imagine that over a year, over 2 years, over 3 years. Of course, we need to keep the impetus going, and we will come back to that. So a lot of this is about making some assumptions, which is a problem for some people. Because most people's reasons for not getting into ROI might tally with some of yours here. It's not exact enough. No, it's not going to be exact enough, but it will get more exact. I like to think of this as compounding. I don't mean compounding like interest, but you make one small change. And when you get comfortable with that, you make another small change. It's like, for example, if you have never moved, you've never done any fitness, but you decide to start walking for 1 mile every morning. Now, 1 mile every morning of itself isn't a huge amount. But if you were doing nothing, it's a step in the right direction. And your 1 mile in the morning might become 1.5 miles, might become 2, might become 3. Might become you buy yourself some new trainers. Might become you start timing it. Might become you start jogging. It might become all sorts of things. That's what we're looking to do. It's not going to be super exact to start with, but it's going to give us an introduction to this concept. And how we put value against soft skills, I've just started to outline some ideas for you. So on a program about better management, one tool was delegation. Delegation's about managing your time, your colleagues' time better, which gave us a corresponding, because I've delegated some of these skills, I don't need to do so much overtime. My overtime has a direct measurable cost because I've now done 1 hour less this week than I would have done last week before learning this model. That's 1 hour that didn't need to be billed to the company. That's a 1 hour saving. Times 10 people, times a month, times 10 months, and so on. But it's also about being a little bit, I shudder to use the word creative, but starting to make some of these cause and effects. One program we ran was on difficult conversations, and I remember it was over a period of months, this program, and in the following month for the difficult conversations, a delegate came up to me and he said, I just wanted to let you know, I used that model for difficult conversations we talked about last time. I sat down with a member of the team who is a lovely individual, but totally wrong for the business. He said, I've been dreading this conversation for a long time and I have put it off. He said, the tool that you shared gave me the confidence to start the conversation. The tool enabled the conversation to be to the point, polite and respectful to both sides. And it quickly got to the question we needed to ask, which is, are we going to stay and make this work, or are we going to cut our losses and end this now? Which was what they decided to do. He said, now, obviously you don't want to lose anybody. But he said, probably worse than losing somebody now is having them for the next 3 months. The loss of productivity while I try and deal with them, the irritation in the wider team, the effect on them, the effect on me, the fact that I'm going to spend 2 or 3 or 4 little meetings here and there, which might be an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, all measurable time. And let's cut it as clearly as we can, 2 or 3 more months paying salary to somebody that is not operating at full capacity. And so by having that conversation, again, you'll notice we are making some assumptions. It's not exact, but it is going to be exact closely enough for this particular start of measurement. And what I mean by that is he was able to say, well, 2 or 3 months of his salary, perhaps a couple of extra hours of my time, and let me make an assumption on how that might affect the team. Now, if all of those have a monetary value, well, that then, against all the other delegates of all the other parts of the program, all starts to add in. Because then what you're doing is you're not telling stories to people who are considering giving you more budget about how great the program is and how much they love it, as I was doing with Darren all those years ago. Instead, what you're saying is, this is what the programs cost, and you need to know what it costs, versus this is where we've made savings or we've increased the income. Now, of course, in terms of your costs, if you're running something in-house, it's up to you how much of that you measure. If you're always going to be delivering L&D anyway, you might say, well, it doesn't actually matter because that's a fixed cost. Do I need to include the salary of the delegates? Some argue, yes, you do, because they're doing this, they're not doing their other job. Others will say, well, no, it's a fixed cost. So some people would say, well, the only real costs you ought to be putting as the cost of your training would be things like an external provider, or a venue we use, or the travel or the accommodation if we had to use that for the event. The same thing runs in conferences as well, by the way. Conferences, once you start to do this approach, are phenomenally expensive. And when you start to think in these terms, you might think, well, I was going to get somebody famous to come and do a keynote speech, 45, 50 minutes. But once you start to look at what some of the more famous people charge, if you apply a little bit of ROI to it, you'll realise that actually there might be some better ways to spend your money. Now, of course, you might think, well, we want somebody famous. We want this sports person or this famous business person or this famous actor. Whatever, that's great. If that's how you want to spend the company's money, fill your boots. But if you think about it from an ROI perspective, there's a clear challenge to what the cost of that is, all the money going out versus what you're seeing come back in. Those last 2 points there, of course, gathering data is so difficult. Yes, it can be. It absolutely can be, which is why what I'm looking to do at all times is find ways to get the delegates to measure that data themselves in the way that I've explained. For me, when I work with managers, it's over the next 4 to 6 weeks, I want you to start jotting down. If there are 3 models you like from today's session or this week's session or this month's session, I want you to jot down the tools that you are using. Because 1, it will absolutely help bolt it into your brain. But 2, it means that every time you do that coaching technique or the delegation technique or the difficult conversation technique or whatever we've talked about, every time you do that, you'll start to notice improvements. You will get better using those things, but more importantly, you will have a consciousness of the commerciality of this discussion you've just had. In other words, we're not just sitting down and going, oh, you're happy, you're not happy, what do you want to do? I'm coming at this from a commercial perspective. And if in 5 minutes we can reach a conclusion that we're both happy with, brilliant. And we have made a major saving there, and we can see something working better for us. And it's not worth a hassle. I mean, it clearly is. So let's dig into this whole idea of ROI a little bit clearer, because that is the classic measure of ROI there. What's the benefit of training minus the cost of training divided by the cost of training? And we need to multiply it by 100%, of course. So let's scale this back. If we think about 10 delegates on a customer service program learning about the ability to ask for an add-on sale during the process, whether that's on the phone or on an online chat function. So what's the cost? What was the benefit of the training? Let's assume that we've seen £20,000 more sale, or let's assume that we're estimating or expecting £20,000 more sale. However you're going to do this. But we've got £20,000. What did the training cost? Well, we brought a provider in, we hired a nice venue, we gave them some lunch. We decide not to include here the salary because they're going to be working anyway. We're not going to include any other costs. We're literally putting cost of venue, cost of provider, cost of lunch. Right, £5,000. So £20,000 minus the £5,000 means £15,000. So if we're going to divide that by the cost of our training, which was 5, we're getting 3 times 100%. We've got a 300% return on our money. We've got our 5 grand back, our £5,000 back for the cost of the training, and we've then made 3 times that. That's a great figure, right? So we can go to our SLT, we can go to our board, and it's a 300% return on investment. Fantastic. The problem, however, with this fairly classic model is that benefit of training. Now, I've just been talking about the benefit of training, but I've kind of done it the other way around, haven't I? Because what I've been talking about is when you've done this method of discussion, or you've done this coaching, or you've approached this difficult conversation in this way, what do you estimate to be the benefits were? Therefore, what was the monetary value? That's often easier than trying to think of it this way around. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do this, but let's develop this other way around, which for many people is a little bit easier. So the cost of training I was just talking about. But what I think we ought to be doing is setting a target for our return on investment and working from there. I also think we ought to be getting our managers and our supervisors who are on the program to be doing a lot more of this than leaving it to us. Now, if you've got nothing else to do, that's great, you can go for it. But most people, this will be easier if it happens at source. Let's set our target at 125%. You can set it at whatever you want. Typically, when I do this, the kind of results I'm seeing back are 300% plus. 412, I remember, at one particular site, which was not measured by us, was not measured by the client, was measured by an independent auditor. But let's set this for 125%. So this means if the program costs 10,000, I'm looking to see 125% of that back. So why would I not sit at 100%? Well, 100% means I do all the work, all of the effort, get my money back, and that's great. It's a bit of a so what, isn't there? Whereas if I say, what was the cost of the training? In the way that we just talked about, we discuss accommodation and salary, cost, all those sorts of things. That gives us a figure. Now, if we then think about our target return on investments, now we've got an amount of money that we're looking to make. And what I would be thinking about is, how can I get the people on the program, particularly if they're managers and supervisors, how can I get them to start to go out to make this money? In other words, how can I give them the responsibility of pursuing and delivering the ROI? Because that would change everything. Rather than 4 to 6 weeks later, me phoning them up or emailing them going, how are you getting on? What have you done? Rather than me messaging and hassling their managers to go, what's happening? What's she doing now? Has he done it? Instead, I'm going to place that responsibility fairly and squarely with the managers and the leaders. Now, that won't work for all populations, but if it's a leadership program, if they are sufficiently senior people, if they are people who want to develop within the business, I'm going to argue that they ought to be delivering our return on investment. And I will share with you a way that we do that that's been very successful. That then gives us our actual return. So how long do they have to do this? Are we going to catch up with them a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now? The longer we give them, arguably the easier it is to achieve that, except we start to work against memory. We start to work against the excitement of being on a program. We know that 24 to 48 hours after a program, if you've not used a skill or an idea, you're increasingly working against our not as good as we think they are memories, and people start to forget detail. And that's not so good, is it? So we need to ensure that we're going to give people enough time to make the change that they want to see, to go for and deliver the return. We need to give them some responsibility for that, and we need to actually see that come back to us. So let me talk a little bit about what we do and the way we do that. So we use a version of the very popular show Dragon's Den, or Shark Tank as you might know it, where what we're looking to do is to put the responsibility fairly and squarely with everybody on the program to deliver the results. So what I'm looking for, maybe a month, 2 months after the close of the program, is for the people on the program to deliver some specific proposals about changes they'd like to see in the business or in their bit of the business. Now, these are most likely to come from what they did on the program. So that serves quite nicely as a reminder and a recap of the key skills they learned. That's great for you if you've bought the program in, or if you've created and delivered the program yourself. But the real value of it is it allows us to see some money back. So let's say we've got our 10 delegates, and let's say the cost of the program was £10,000. That means that each delegate cost £1,000 to be on that program. If we've set each delegate a target of bringing in £1,250, then what we're looking to see there is a value, if 2 of them get together, of £2,500. If 3 of them, £3,750. You can pick whatever figures you want. But the key point here is that 1, the delegates must know the cost of them being on the program. And 2, they must also know the targets that you set them to achieve using what they have learned on the program. Now, what tends to happen is that whilst they start with some key elements of the program that they found useful and engaging that they start to use, they often will come back with some improvements and some changes and some adjustments. They come back with some asks. And it's a very well-worn idea that the people who are most able to make improvements to the delivery of the business are the people who are at the sharp end. So why wouldn't we take advantage of that? Why would we not bring that together? So typically what will happen a month, 2 months later is our 10 people might have got themselves into 1 person working by himself, 4 people working by themselves, a 2 and a 3. So however many people are in your group is absolutely fine, but each of you are carrying the cost of you being on that program. And what you have to do is to create and deliver a proposal to the Dragon's Den. Now, quick phrasing on the Dragon's Den Shark Tank idea. We are going to take the exploratory element of those programs. In other words, pitching an idea to senior people and then, in a nice way, picking over the details to make sure it works. Make sure it's bulletproof is the phrasing I use. We're not going for all the theatrics on those TV shows, very popular though they are. But we are looking for a strong commercial argument. In other words, our delegates ought to be in front of senior people saying, right, we have noticed the problem in our part of the business is X, which we are estimating costs Y. One of the things that we did on the program was this topic, and doing this topic brought us to realise this, this, and this. And when we learnt that, we realised that we ought to be running this program for our colleagues. The cost of doing that is going to be this. We expect the outcome to be that. And therefore the payback period will be so long. And at that point, we'll start to move into these kind of savings. In fact, SLT, the cost of us three doing the program this far has been this amount. The payback to you over the next 2 weeks of us doing this program will be this amount. So what you're starting to do here is a number of things that are working very, very well. You've got solutions and offers to the people that are in a position to go, yes, we'll do that, or no, we won't. Some of them may require extra spend, of course. But you are bringing the purpose of training and development, of learning, right up close with commerciality. The reason we should be doing an L&D program, the reason we should be teaching, is because we want to see a fundamental improvement in the workplace. And this pretty much forces you to do that. More importantly, it forces the people who are supposed to be learning to do this. So you are not required as the HR or the L&D person to be chasing them down to make sure they've done their homework. We move away from this idea of just giving presentations about, oh, here's what I learned. That's interesting, but in a very nice way. It's a little bit trite, it's a little bit pointless. Instead, I learnt this. I've made this improvement. This is now what we're doing. This gives you a great visibility with your teams. It gives your senior people a direct connection to the program. It gives your people who've been on the program an opportunity to bask in the glow of a job well done. And crucially, it gives you absolutely clear evidence that your budget was this, you spent it here, and this has been the return. Now that is a compelling argument when it comes to why your budget should be bigger next year, why you need more help, why you want to run another program, or wherever you're going with this. Now we've done this a number of times and the result is pretty much always really, really powerful. But the big question is, how do you make this run not just now or next month or next year, but 2 or 3 years from now? Because if you don't have SLT support, if you don't have board level support, you're always working against something that is incredibly powerful. And I've seen plenty of organisations where the programs that are run are first rate, but they only ever go as far as they can because there is, frankly, a malign malevolence from very senior people. So if you don't have a level of support from your SLT, you're always going to be stuck. And how good is your learning culture? See, are you doing lunch and learn every third Friday? You're doing yoga every Tuesday morning? These things are great, and I'm not being flippant when I talk about them, but a learning culture goes deeper than that. A learning culture absolutely encourages. It wants people to get into our programs. It wants people to develop, and the business as a whole is going to be far more engaged and engaging if you are there demonstrating, when you come on one of our programs, that bit of the business makes more money, or that bit of the business wastes less money. Your staff turnover reduces, our retention increases. So we start to actually see far greater levels of improvement and far greater levels of buy-in and engagement right the way through the business. Learning culture isn't just, oh, we've got 300 programs on our LMS. So what? What are they doing with them? How often are they being accessed? And when they are accessed, what changes do they make in the day-to-day program? The absolute central core to what I've been talking about throughout this particular program. What's the level of management support like? If you've got managers who still believe that going on a program is a day off, you are really swimming against the tide, aren't you? And how easy is it for people to access learning where you are? Because we know from talking with enough people, and you probably come across the same thing yourself, you will always find people who are absolutely self-motivated. They want to go and learn and develop. And if we can't create something for them at the point of need, the point of, oh, I know what I should do, I want to learn this, then they're always going to be a flight risk. If we can't help and improve and develop them, we run the risk of losing them to a business or an organisation that's more engaged and engaging, that wants to develop and create more ways of working and taking people into more exciting ways. So, easy to say, never stop learning. Easy to say, we've got a learning culture. But the question is, how good is your learning culture? The question is, how easy do you make it for your colleagues to never stop learning? And that pretty much is everything I want to talk about to you in this session. If you've enjoyed it, there's a bunch of things down the bottom there that we tend to work in. These tend to be the areas that we develop all of those kind of skills, and those are the most commonly requested ones. There are plenty of other areas that we help people with, as well as films, facilitation, keynote training, learning, presentations, all sorts of anything. Anytime you need somebody to come and help with those, we are absolutely able to help you. You can find me on bluebeetle.co.uk. You can find me, of course, on LinkedIn, Graham David 1. There I am. And if you like your online stuff to be a little bit more mixed up, bit of comedy, something a bit more edgy, a few random rants about business, then find me on TikTok. I'll be delighted to hear from you. Other than that, I hope you've enjoyed this program. If you have, please do say so in the comments. Nothing bad will happen. It won't cost you a penny, but it will help me. Thanks for being here. I'll see you again soon.